Some people have asked about. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jill Lackett at the North Central Climate Science Center, and this is the Adaptation Working Group webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started here. I think some more people might be logging on, but in the interest of time, we'll get started. We have Hailey Wilmer here today to give the presentation, and she is a Climate Hub Fellow at the USDA Northern Plains Climate Hub, which is housed here in Fort Collins at the Agriculture Research Service. She's also a PhD candidate in the Rangeland Ecosystem Science Department here at CSU, and she and her advisor, Maria Fernanda Jimenez, have been collaborating with ARS researchers on decision-making and collaborative adaptive management since 2013. She's finishing up her dissertation the next few weeks, so we appreciate her taking the time out to give the webinar today. So she'll go ahead and get started when she's ready.
Okay, thanks Jill for the introduction and the chance to talk about our project and some initial results. This is really a 10-year project, and we're 3 years in, depending on how you count. So I just wanted to introduce some of the work that Maria and I have been doing in collaboration, primarily with Justin Durner and David Augustine at ARS, but also with David Brisky at Texas A&M, and Lauren Ferensky, who's an ecologist at ARS, has joined on and actually taken a little bit of a leadership role in the social science as well, which has been really fun. So I'll just give an overview of what I'll talk about today. A little bit of a background on the approach, specifically from Maria's perspective in forest and rangeland stewardship, and then talk about two components of this project: the Adaptive Grazing Management experiment, which is taking place on the Central Plains Experimental Range, just east of Fort Collins in Nunn, Colorado, on the Shortgrass steppe, and then a ranch decision-making case study, which is paired with that experiment, where we're following 16 family ranches for 3 years. And then talk about kind of our next steps for some decision-making support tools, specifically a climate adaptation handbook for ranchers in the Great Plains. So stop me at any time if you have questions, because I don't have a super long presentation. So I'll start with the experiment, which is kind of the exciting thing for me, really, because originally as a grad student, I was just taking notes for this project, and then it kind of morphed into a great opportunity for us all to learn from each other. And we've had a lot of great discussions about the nature of science and the nature of knowledge, and sort of how do we learn. So I'll talk a little about what the experiment is and the theoretical framework we're testing, and then what I'm doing as a social researcher within that project to sort of understand the adaptive management process in this context. And we phrase this a lot of times as the closing of the loop, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of adaptive management. But here's where we are. We're in the Shortgrass steppe. And when I talk to non-ecologist audiences, I kind of say, imagine the Shortgrass is kind of the astroturf of the prairies. It grows on you, but it doesn't grow very tall. But this is also a pretty interesting place because of the concerns that we have to manage for diversity in vegetation, also for grassland bird species, which are in decline, almost all of them in decline because of concerns over lack of heterogeneity, partially because of our grazing management historically, and then also lack of fire in the system, and then, of course, habitat loss. And then at the same time, the Shortgrass is kind of unique in terms of public land, because folks tend to agree that grazing is an important ecological process and cattle should be out there in some way to manage for these species. And so the beef and birds component is really strong in this project, and trying to think about how all three of these objectives can come together. And Justin Durner kind of jokes that it's a boots and beef and birds and Birkenstocks approach. In 2013, well, actually, we started the project in 2012. 2012 was a drought, so we waited a year and then implemented this project under the Collaborative Adaptive Landscape Management Framework. So it takes the idea of adaptive management, that structured, science-based decision-making process, and adds this collaborative component, which has really been the rub. We brought stakeholders together from across, we sort of handpicked them from across the area. We have 3 representatives of conservation nonprofit organizations. We have 3 representatives from, well, now 4, we've added the State Land Board, from government agencies, the Forest Service and Natural Resources Conservation Service. We have the State Land Board. We have a spot for the Colorado State Rangeland Extension Specialist in the eastern side of the state who just got hired, so we're going to be inviting that person. And then we have one more government agency. And then we've got 4 ranchers who are actually part of the grazing association that leases the land that the Central Plains Experimental Range is on. So they've been providing steers since the 30s, and so we have a really long-term, really solid relationship with those ranchers. So they have 4 boats, everyone else has 3. So it's been kind of interesting in that context. And the real idea behind this collaborative approach is the social learning concept, which is a little bit tricky, but the general idea is that learning is social, knowledge is situated, which means it's contextual. Can we bring folks together, sit them down in the same room, involve them in our science, and meet these objectives for the beasts, the birds, and the vegetation as well? And that's, we've had debates about to what extent as a collaborative scientific team we had a simplistic idea of this when we started out. I think we've certainly gained a better understanding of the complexities of the power of knowledge, even in this science-based approach. And I'll talk a little bit more exactly about how these stakeholders are making decisions, but the general idea is that they meet 3 to 4 times a year and decide how we're going to manage this rangeland. So I'll present findings from my qualitative interviews. I've been attending meetings since the fall of 2013. We have in-depth interviews with each stakeholder. There are 11 emails. We have memos. We did a focus group last April with the stakeholders relative to how we're doing, and this is just 3 years in, so I think it's a good baseline for us to look at the project. And here are my code, just kind of give you an idea of how we're thinking about what's happening in these interviews and in these meeting transcripts. We're working to understand the processes of learning about ecological processes and then social learning as well, and there's a lot of crossover, particularly with cattle production. So just to throw that up there, I'll give you an idea of kind of what this experimental ranch looks like. What we did with this study is the blue pastures here are adaptively managed pastures, and the yellow pastures are our traditionally managed pastures. So in this system, on the public lands in the Shortgrass, kind of the conventional approach has been a moderate stocking rate, season-long continuous grazing. So in these half-section pastures, that's about 20 head of yearling cattle. And we let the stakeholders make decisions about the blue pastures. There are 10 of them. They decided to set some baseline rules. They wanted to rest at least 2 pastures a year. They wanted to do a rotational grazing, so they grouped all of the cattle into one herd. So we have between 220 and 230 in a half-section pasture. And then they wanted to work on finding ecological triggers for rotation between the pastures that would meet goals for vegetation diversity, heterogeneity, in terms of bird habitat, and then also cattle production, all of those goals at the same time. And so you see here, this is the 2014 grazing sequence. They set triggers for pasture movement, interestingly, based on the visual obstruction of the grassland, so how tall is the grass across the pasture. We had a really hard time in 14 and 15 meeting those thresholds. The cattle just couldn't eat the grass short enough. And so we had some backup triggers. We had maximum days, and then we worked with, interesting, the cowboys on the station that work for ARS and for the Grazing Association and the ranchers in this study. They developed a pretty intricate monitoring checklist for cattle behavior on a daily and weekly basis. And in the fall of 15, the Cowboys showed up with these really great graphs that monitored this over time that we didn't even ask them for. So they've been, you know, doing a great job of kind of correlating that with how the kind of forage that their cattle are getting. And one of the tricks here is we weigh cattle at the beginning of the year and the end of the year, or opportunistically as we can if they go by the scale. So we don't really know how well they're doing in terms of weight gain every week or something like that. But we do have a lot of other measurements. I mean, we've got a grad student collecting fecal samples. We've got GPS collars and pedometers, vegetation monitoring. The stakeholders have really piped in about what they want to see. They want to see more pictures so they can really, you know, this number of pounds per acre to a picture of what that looks like on the shortgrass. So that's been an interesting process. In 2014, so we wanted to rest 2 pastures. We ended up resting 3. And we did do a burn, and then in 2015 we ended up resting 6. So our triggers were a little off compared to our objectives there. This gives you an idea of kind of what those cattle are doing. So at the top are our traditionally grazed cattle, and the bottom are our adaptively grazed cattle. And because of the density of cattle, which is a pretty well understood phenomenon in the shortgrass, we have a higher density of cattle in these adaptively grazed pastures, and they just don't get to be very selective. So they're actually, our average daily gains are down per head, and that's kind of been the interesting component here. But our gains per acre are up, so we're resting more pastures. And we did do a burn in the fall of 2014, which was pretty fun. The pronghorn come along and they eat the cactus that has been burnt, and the stakeholders come out in the fall and the spring and look at it. So you know, just to summarize David Augustine's monitoring lessons, we do have trade-offs between cattle gains on a per head average daily gain basis, but those rested pastures are future forage banks for drought. We have some cool season perennial restoration and definitely some habitat for grasshopper sparrows in the first 2 years. We did a process tracing method with our qualitative results to see sort of where decisions are happening and whether folks are learning, and this is an interesting question. So what this represents is kind of analogous to a tree ring with each layer of blue here as a different year of the project. We did baseline data in 13, and then you can see all these SHs, our stakeholder meetings. So it's quite a bit of time and investment for these stakeholders. The ranchers certainly are volunteering time away from their own operations. Everyone else's bosses have been generous in donating their time. So they met and established goals for wildlife, vegetation, and beef production. And of course, you know, this is an experiment, this is science, so it takes us quite a bit of time to get information on, you know, really what's happening, really what our monitoring results. But we didn't really see 2014's vegetation data until this spring. And that's because, you know, you treat it, then it comes up the next year, then you measure it, and you understand it. So there is definitely a time lag in this formal adaptive management process. And there's also a little bit of learning lag. We worked backwards on the grazing rotation decisions. So what triggers were folks using? How are they learning? How are they adjusting those triggers for pasture management? Were they you know, using the data when they talked about what they decided to do in this consensus-based decision-making? And really, I think that that demonstrates the weight of folks' existing range management paradigms, even in this new management context. And so we had some folks that were really pushing us towards faster rotation, smaller pastures, other folks that boy, 10 pastures, that's a lot of rotation, and that's a lot of pastures for me. And then we had an interesting thing happen in the fall of 2015. You'll notice there's only one little flame on this chart. We rested 6 pastures, which is a lot, and our data showed us that the burn we conducted the year before improved the forage quality on the burn for cattle. It definitely helped with mountain plover habitat. And what basically happened with the vote was the ranchers all voted not to burn, even though we had 6 rested pastures. The agency folks all abstained, and the wildlife advocates all voted to burn. And it's been a pretty consensus-based collaborative group until then, and that refusal to burn it caused a lot of, I don't want to say drama, but it was very interesting for us to go back and think through look at the notes and understand what was going on with that. And I think that really brought to our attention and kicked off a discussion of risk perception. We're working with a group of producers who don't traditionally use fire, and they live through the Dust Bowl, and they live through, not having enough forage. So that discussion of even if the data telling us it's a good thing in the short term, we really understand what can happen if it doesn't rain in this system. And I think that was hard for everybody. So that's kind of the process tracing. We did perceive that there'd be a lot of conflict in setting up the goals, and actually the goals were the easiest thing to do. How to reach those has been the tricky thing. We've found that we go out in the fall and look at one little spot in the pasture, and that can have a huge influence on the decisions that people are making. Even though we might have a chart that shows the trends over the course of the year. We've actually found different roles for different subgroups of stakeholders. Discussions tend to be more collaborative and aware of each other's goals when we're out in the field instead of sitting down in a room. And we try to do group activities, and I think one thing that we've all recognized is this is a group of scientists leading a group of managers. We're not all teachers, we're not all facilitators. We kind of underestimated the need for facilitation. And so we try to do this kind of mental mapping, how do you think the Shortgrass works activity with lots of sticky notes and lots of smelling markers, and it was very fun for the ecologists, but it was really frustrating for some of the stakeholders. Just to be expected to sort of map out linearly how does the system work and what's going to happen if we do what, was actually pretty frustrating. We spent quite a bit of time responding to that. So we are seeing cases where folks are adjusting actions in the transcripts based on the results that they're seeing and then questioning their assumptions. So just from 2 6-hour meetings, we're seeing examples of that where folks are having those assumptions questioned about what will happen in the Shortgrass given specific management actions. So I have some examples. But this rancher on the bottom, I'll just read this quote. He said, "I've been asking myself all year long, why didn't the cattle gain? What did we do wrong? Would we move them too often, too less? How to fix it? I have no idea. All of this is an experiment to me, and I kind of go with what these guys are saying." So that has a lot of layers to it in terms of what is this rancher deciding to do. He's recognizing that this is an experiment. He wants to get along with folks, but he's going to go with what the other ranchers say too. And that's come out. So folks haven't necessarily been voting in blocks in their subgroups, but the stakeholders have mentioned to us they're concerned that folks get siloed and vote with each other. So yeah, just to go back to that, those two, the grazing decision and the fire, have been kind of our main points of emphasis, but we're recognizing some trade-offs between those. And one of the ideas of social learning is this idea of a community of practice, and it's basically if we all get together and try to get better at something we care about, we're learning. And it's kind of hard to know if we're doing that. There have been a lot of examples of interaction between the scientists and the stakeholders, and the stakeholders have called us out for saying, you haven't recognized yourselves as stakeholders. You are stakeholders. You're not just objective scientists who are looking in from the outside, so that's been kind of fun. Those cattle monitoring checklists that I talked about have been fun. The ranchers were concerned that we weren't doing a good enough job monitoring the economics, so they developed our criteria for economic monitoring. We have email updates and dialogues. And we've definitely done some things to change the process of the decision-making as well. And we have debates in our team because we have ecologists, we have social scientists, we have debates about how participatory this project really is, how much power do we want to give to those stakeholders. We still want to have our controls. How long do we need to wait before we really know something enough to say, yeah, we learned this. I think those challenges are always going to be there. But it's been really fun. And so far in the interviews, folks actually seem pretty engaged. We've had a few burnout moments, which I would expect after 3 years, but folks are engaged, and I think they see this as the experimental part of it is really exciting because it allows them to play with these things without the normal risk that they would have in their professional lives. We've just hired a postdoc, Michelle Stewart, who will be here at CSU, she'll probably be looking at the politics of knowledge in this project and doing some interviews with the scientists as well. I said I also have an interest in the politics of knowledge, but I have more of an interest in the politics of getting a job. So I'm not going to do those interviews, but it does need to be done. And I think just the email exchanges we've had about sort of these frameworks has been really interesting. They're definitely bridging roles, and that's something that's been really key. Because we handpicked our stakeholders, we found folks that were collaborative, that weren't already suing each other outside of the experiment. And as folks have come and gone from the project, different stakeholders have taken a leadership role in explaining science to ranchers, explaining ranching to scientists. We have not hit a drought yet. We're planning for drought. We think we have a 2-year drought plan built into this current approach, but the ranchers are really the only ones that understand drought in this system. So that's the next step for us. And it could make it a lot more exciting. So hopefully we get one. I don't really want to say that, but yeah, so we do have a lot of collaborators and partners on this project. And the CCC here at Colorado State has helped support my social analysis for these findings. So I don't know if anybody else has questions at that point.
Thanks, Hailey. Any questions?
Okay.
Hi.
Second section. Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. This is Cody Knudsen with the National Drought Mitigation Center over in Nebraska. Yeah, I really like Hailey, and I really like the longitudinal aspect especially. And, we work on the drought side, and that was the comment I was going to make, is that we'd really like to see how their management changes when drought hits. And odds are good. Say you're 3 years into the 10-year project, so the odds are good you're going to get one in there. Yeah. So I'd just be really interested in to see how that changes things up. We've been doing a lot of work with ranchers to help prepare the drought plans and what to do during droughts with our managing risk on the ranch website. And I see you had Pat Reese on there in one of the pictures. He was working with us on that. He did a lot of that.
Cool. Okay.
So he's really familiar with what we've been doing anyway.
That's great. Yeah, Pat was with us early in the project, and then he's not with us anymore. So.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, it's been tricky to keep expertise on, and people are so busy. But yeah, and I think that that's been part of the question is how well do we know these relationships between the density issue and the weight gain issue, but will it pay off later in a drought with that? Yeah,
in resting those pastures, they say that's really when it pays off is when the drought hits. You might lose a little during your, the years, but when the drought hits, that's when they're supposed to pay off. So. Yeah,
that's what's supposed to happen. So we'll see what happens. And the other interesting thing about it is that in this community, the grazing association sort of has a rule where if you have to go home, your neighbor has to go home. So it'll be interesting to see how the findings from this project transfer to other ranchers in the area, and if there's some incentive to start to manage it for that drought banking, if the whole community has to do it or nothing. So.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for your question.
This is Trevor with the Climate Science Center. And I was just wondering, on that project, did you guys monitor soil moisture penetration and any differences that you might have seen with different grazing intensities or stuff like that?
We did measure it. We haven't analyzed it yet. I think David Augustine at the last meeting, NRCS has really been pushing us to do that analysis. I think that he hadn't even opened the file yet. So that's the other problem is just we have so much data.
There's worse problems. Right. And I had another question, too, is in my experience, there's this kind of split between researchers who are really interested in things like drought and maybe ranchers who kind of dread drought and psychologically maybe don't want to think about it. And I'm wondering if you ever had any challenges bringing up the issue of drought and planning for it and its impacts, and if so, how you navigated those.
We haven't had them yet, but I think they're coming, and that's a really good point. I think we saw that with fire. Fire is a non-starter in this community, probably for the same reason, because it just doesn't make sense to folks to burn your grass when you could be grazing it, right? So that's what we're hoping, is that we can sit around the table together long enough to get sick of each other to the point where we're willing to compromise a little bit more. But what might happen is we might hit an economic threshold where wildlife advocates and grass advocates have to really pay attention in a different way too. So yeah, I mean, we try not to say we're hoping for a drought to see what happens.
Yeah, right. Right, exactly. Popular comment. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and I saw on there too you had drought and climate change. Have you brought up the climate change issue in the meeting?
No, we haven't brought it up yet. I think that we have a really nice window into sort of the 10-year time frame that ranchers tend to think on with climate change. Individually, different stakeholders have brought it up, but in terms of the focus of the project, that's a real tricky one. And I think we need to do a better job of thinking about how we're going to talk to folks about that. And it might be that we need to think about some scenarios, and we need to work through some, shorter time frames or something that people think they can observe because they're already experiencing a lot of variability in the climate. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point too. You could bring up some historical things too. And in most areas, there's been some changes already. People seem to respond to that a little better in projections.
Yeah, saying, okay, this is what the 30s was like, this is what the 50s were like, and yeah. It's a good point.
This is Shannon McNeely. I have a question.
Hi, Shannon.
Hi. So about the social learning part, and I don't know if you're the one that would be able to answer this question or not, because I'm curious more about sort of the methodology on that side of things in terms of, one of the hard things about doing actual analysis of social learning is having sort of quote unquote baseline data, right, at the beginning of the project, and then monitoring the learning throughout, and how you monitor that and how you control for, people learn a lot of different ways outside of this particular process that may or may not be attributed to the actual adaptive management process. So are you able to speak to that a little bit more in terms of how the team went about that process?
Yeah, you touched on all the issues that we're still working through. I think when we started the project, we had a very sort of free-flowing observational, approach to our methods, where the idea was that if we just meticulously recorded everything that everyone said, the discourse analysis would sort of sort through the social learning. And I think in particular theoretical frameworks, that's not untrue. But it's come up a lot, and one of our stakeholders is actually a social psychologist, and so we have had some fair time, kind of butts there with what are we measuring and are we controlling for the process outside versus the inside. And essentially, I think what we're trying to assess at this point is just whether this experiment creates a context where folks can apply what they already know and apply that to new research objectives or new management objectives. So in terms of learning, we're assessing what decisions did they actually make and how did they talk about why they made those decisions, and to get at that from multiple angles. So there's definitely, some gaps in the causality. It's much more descriptive. One of the things that I don't think we really realized was how much we didn't account for the fact that people's knowledge systems are living, breathing, developing things outside of the project. So we were kind of assessing their learning inside of the project in a bubble, and then realized that a couple of them have been consulting with a retired range professor at CSU about what to say in the meetings or how to manage these issues, and so that's been a big political learning process for us as well. I don't know if that's
I guess that was probably the case. I mean, social learning analysis is notoriously difficult for all of those reasons. So you kind of have to work around it and come up with, you know, kind of proxies and things like that. So you're not really getting pure learning from the beginning, but more sort of how knowledge is used in the process and how that informs or not decision making.
Yeah, and I think we've also come to realize the value of having an experiment. Not just are we doing collaborative adaptive management in a public land setting, but this is a mock public land setting. And that's been huge because people can experiment. You know, they can try things they wouldn't normally try. So that's been helpful. And in that sense, it's almost more of a participatory research project than a, you know, a classroom or something. So.
Right. But there hasn't been any, it sounds like there hasn't been any survey work, or if you said that, I missed it, to try and document the learning process. More just been sort of participant observation type stuff. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's been just the in-depth interviews. It's been a series of interviews and focus groups, and then a series of sort of group activities that we've done together. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. And I think we could do that survey work. We have to be really careful. Our stakeholders are close to burning out. We ask a lot from them, and that's one of the constraints.
Yeah, it's the combination of stakeholder fatigue with not necessarily having a you know, perfect sort of baseline data set to be gauging against. That's the tricky part.
And what is cool is we have that traditionally grazed herd. So we do have that comparison in terms of the learning on the ecological side. We have that comparison as a nice baseline there. Cool.
Any other questions, or did you have anything else?
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to chat everyone's ear off. But thanks for listening, and if y'all have suggestions or other comments, you're welcome to email me. I go backwards here slowly. Very open to feedback, so I appreciate it very much.
Okay. Thanks, Hailey.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a few announcements before folks sign off. The Adaptation Working Group is holding a workshop here at CSU August 31st and September 1st. So everyone is welcome. Let me know if you would like to attend that, if you haven't already. Also, the call just came out from the National Adaptation Forum for the call for proposals for symposia, training sessions, and working groups. I'm also going to be sending out more information about that, but yes, we're starting to think about some sort of group submission or proposal for that. So stay tuned. I'll send out more information about that. And next month, Amy Simstad and Brian Miller will be doing the Adaptation Working Group webinar.
I will be?
Yeah. He's looking at me with a blank stare, but so, yeah, I'll send out information on that. Okay. If that's it, then I guess we can sign off a little bit early then. All right. Thanks, Hailey.
Okay, thank you.
All righty.